Alrighty, welcome to Lectures with Liddington. In this episode, we're going to start introducing our unit on biochemistry. So we're going to be talking specifically about the chemicals that make up you, that make up all living things. And in order to get the ball rolling and start talking about that, we really have to understand the basis of all living things, the element that is most common in the molecules that make up all living things. And that molecule is carbon. Carbon is our VIP. So let's talk about it. So essentially, the most important thing to know about carbon is that it is cool. It is the most important molecule in all living things because it can do so much stuff. It can make lots of different molecules. And the reason being because it has a very unique structure. Now, if you look at this picture here on the side, we have our diagram. Remember, we drew some atoms. This is our drawing of carbon. And we can see that it has 1, 2, 3, 4 electrons in that valence shell, right? That valence shell is that outer shell. And that's the one where the electrons are going to interact with the other electrons in other atoms around it. So when you have those 4 electrons, that means you have 4 spaces that you can now share electrons with covalently. So each one of these is a spot where you can have a covalent bond. So now we've got 4 different locations around our carbon where you can have a covalent bond. And this allows for an incredibly wide variety of organic molecules. Okay, organic molecules. Well, what does that mean? When we talk about organic in biology, we are not talking about labels that you see in your grocery store. We are talking about carbon-containing molecules. These are the molecules that make up all living things. So that's what we're referring to when we talk about organic here in this class. We're talking about carbon-based biological molecules. And because carbon has that flexibility to bond with so many different atoms, it can create many different types of molecules. So you're going to see it in lots of different shapes and sizes as we continue talking about biochemistry. They can come in rings. They can come in branches. So they can be these odd little chinked off branches going in all different directions, or we can have these nice straight chains. And depending on the shape, it's going to impact their function. So all different shapes can do all different things, which is why carbon is so cool, because it can make so many different things. Another little tidbit about carbon is on organic molecules, you will have your carbon chains, but you'll also have these other little pieces that are coming off of them. And those little pieces are called functional groups. So these little groupings of atoms that get attached to a main organic molecule, and depending on what they are, can impact, again, the function of the molecules. Depending on what functional groups are present, will impact what that molecule is able to do. The most common functional groups are polar. They tend to be polar. Remember, it means they're charged. And a vocabulary word here. When something is polar, it tends to be hydrophilic. And that means it's attracted to water. So if you break down hydrophilic, hydro means water. And philic means loving. So it literally means water loving. It's attracted to the water. Another option here is hydrophobic. So something that is hydrophobic is afraid, right? Phobic is afraid. So they are afraid of water. Hydrophobic things will turn away from water. They're repelled away from water. Think of like arachnophobia, right? You are afraid of spiders. Hydrophobic, those are molecules that are afraid of water. So generally speaking, your functional groups tend to be hydrophilic, polar, they like water. So the four most common functional groups that we see are these. Hydroxyl groups, these are those OH groups at the end. Remember we talked about OHs, OH ions, when we talked about bases, right? That should be a little connection that we've seen before. Carbonyl groups, this is when we have a carbon and that oxygen double bonded, coming off something. Carboxyl groups are written as COOH. You've got two oxygens bonded in slightly different ways to the carbon. Amino groups are NH2, coming off of something. That amino group, that word should hopefully trigger us later because there are things called amino acids that we'll talk about in a later episode. But just so we've seen it, amino groups, these are ones that have that nitrogen in them. When you see that nitrogen, you know you're looking there. And then phosphate groups also become important because P is phosphorus. There's a very important molecule that we're going to talk about later called ATP. And that phosphate group is part of that P. That's what that P stands for. So that's a very important molecule as we talk about living things. Oh, there we go. Now we can see our phosphate group a little bit more effectively there. So let's practice making some organic molecules.